All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Healthy Masculinity National Conversation Series. My name is Greerlin Thomas. I am a Training and Technical Assistance Program Manager with Men Can Stop Rape. I also am a veteran member of their Men of Strength Club, and I've been with the organization for, let's say, about 7 years. So we're going to jump into our conversation today, but first I want our panelists to introduce themselves. So Addison, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, thank you for having us again. It's really great to be here. So I'm Addison Moore. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the drop-in programs manager for SMYAL. And SMYAL is an LGBTQ plus serving organization. We're based in DC and served, prior COVID, we served DC, Maryland, and Virginia folks, but now we've expanded our programming and services to try and reach folks across the country. And we work with ages 6 to 24 through a variety of different programs. We have our drop-in programs now from 4 to 7, and we also have our leadership programming still happening, as well as a housing program for 18 to 24-year-olds, and that is a transitional living housing that really helps our youth go from homelessness and to self-sufficiency. And so yeah, that's a little bit about SMYAL and the position that I do.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Connor. I am the LGBTQ service navigator for Montgomery County. I work specifically in Montgomery County for a program called MoCo Reconnect. We target youth 16 to 24 who have either dropped out or at risk of dropping out of high school, or who have graduated but are either not working or not going to college. And we offer GED programming, job training assistance, help assist accessing higher education opportunities, or possibly like vocational training if that is what they are interested in. And I work with LGBTQ youth and help them remove barriers that they may have in accessing those services. So it might be accessing benefits, transportation, housing insecurity, anything like that. Right now, our centers are also closed due to COVID, so I am working on some of our drop-in chat spaces during the day and the evening.
All right, great. Well, thank you both for joining us today. So part of what we do is an organization, or a primary prevention organization that deals primarily with engaging men around issues of gender-based violence and sexual assault. And so part of the way that we do that is through an approach we like to call healthy and unhealthy masculinity. And so part of what that is thinking through what are some ways that more traditional forms of masculinity can be dangerous or harmful or not helpful towards pro-social community building and for the individual, and what are some alternative ways that masculinity can be utilized to create pro-social environments and foster environmental change, right? And so what we wanted to do with this is, like with any of our previous conversation series, is sort of bring that lens to talking about a particular topic or a particular group of people or a particular area of study or something like that. And so we thought, and we've been working very hard to sort of get people to talk with us about their own experiences with working with this conversation around LGBTQ individuals and the communities. And so we'll just get started right away. And so the first thing I wanted us to think about is, what are some unhealthy aspects of masculinity that we think may show up in LGBTQ communities?
You want to start? Or you want me to start?
You can go ahead.
I think there's a lot of them that play out. There's definitely a lot of preconceived notions around butch versus femme identities, gay men who might be more effeminate in their presentation. There's a lot on in dating about no femmes, and a lot of times they are looked down upon. People just just act normal, or be a man, man up, whatever. Similar things that you hear in other areas, even among straight men, things like that. I think it also, because there's still a lot of trans people in the the gay community. Then there's also a lot of, against both trans women and trans men, a lot of discrimination that goes around that because of those identities, those ideals of what a man should be.
Yeah, I think really to what you said, Connor, there's a lot of those things I would say as well that just, and I would add on to that as well, that when it comes to masculinity, it can also depend on like gender, how folks are raised, and how it seems to show up in a lot of spaces they move through. Like in my experience, so I was raised as a woman, but I have now been able to live as, like, I'm perceived as a man in society, in the way that that has shown me what my masculinity means to the world is a lot different than before. I've presented very masculinely, and when I'm entering LGBTQ spaces, it's interesting because there are still some ways that roles that traditionally masculine folks, or when looking at cisgender or heterosexual folks, ways that masculinity is viewed in that community will transfer over to the LGBTQ community. So assuming like the roles people play, whether it's in private or like within sexual relationships, within the way people navigate the world, they're like, well, if you're the more masculine one, you might have to pay for dinner, or you might have to do like those things that are associated with usually cis men or straight men. And I think that because of that, a lot of folks are just emulating what they've been taught masculinity means, and it can still end up being like unhealthy in a lot of ways, where folks feel like they're not able to express their emotions because they're like, well, if I'm masculine, that means that I'm not supposed to be able to do that. Or a lot of these things that show up in, like, a lot of these feelings and ways that people navigate what it means to be masculine, it pops up, it similarly will pop up in the LGBTQ community, because they're trying to understand not only their own identities and navigating what that means, but within a system that they've already been taught.
And so what I'm hearing in that is that there are sort of certain things that are true of anyone who's sort of raised in a society that prioritizes masculinity over femininity in certain ways, right? So whether you're straight or not, whether you're straight or gay or cis or trans, there are certain things about masculinity that you sort of pick up on, and depending on who you are, you end up abiding by for many of the same reasons. And so I'm curious, what would you say are some ways that these struggles show up a bit more uniquely for LGBTQ people that may be different from how they may show up for cisgendered straight people?
I think I usually see it play out in the way folks feel like they can present, and how safe that, or how does that safety look like when they're presenting. A lot of folks who may like have more feminine traits, or like to express themselves or be what's considered feminine, they feel like those are parts of themselves that they have to hide and stifle because they're worried about being outed or being accepted. Because even within the LGBTQ community, there's a way that femininity can be looked down upon compared to masculinity. And for those folks, it usually ends up being not only navigating not only are they having to navigate their identity and figuring out what that means, but then they're having to navigate, well, what parts of my identity are, even in this community, are going to be accepted and are going to be like really acknowledged. Because we've had conversations with young people where we're having to understand, like, why do you think someone being loud is feminine, being quiet is masculine, and why are you associating these things, and having to break that down with them, because there are people that are like, oh, I would date them or I would want to be friends with them, but I think they might out me, right? And for some people that can be safety. So the way that can show up can look very different depending on the multiple identities that someone can hold, but also whether or not they're thinking of their safety when making these decisions. Because looking at specifically with men within the LGBTQ community, whether they're trans or cis, the way that can look is really what does being a man mean, and trying to navigate like that system. And then particularly with our gender nonconforming youth or non-binary youth, they're navigating, well, what does masculinity mean, or what does femininity mean? And then for sometimes for the youth that we do get to interact with, who are femme or trans identified or trans women, a lot of them are navigating like, well, I was raised up with these ideals, with these like, how do I break those down in order to, you know, to really move through this world in the way I feel most comfortable, but then also understanding that privilege might be lost. So it's so different for each community, even within this broader community, about like how to navigate masculinity and how it affects them in their everyday lives and the people that they communicate with.
Yeah, one of the things that I used to see when I worked with LGBTQ youth in New York is young cis men who liked dating trans women, but still identified as straight. They would come to our centers because it was the only place they felt safe interacting with trans women, which is fine, but it's twofold, because then they would also be a lot of times intolerant to our gay identified youth. And then at the same time, when they went back out on the street, then they were just as homophobic or transphobic as everyone else, which a lot of times then their girlfriends would experience, intimate partner violence, physical or emotional violence, abuse, that kind of thing. It wasn't a safe environment. And then on the other side of that are young masculine of center, so either trans men or even, butch identified women, trying to figure out and navigate their own, coming to terms with their own masculinity. Very often they latched onto the more toxic masculine roles, which were very often rooted in misogyny. So they could be very abusive as well to their especially to their female partners, and very demeaning and things like that. So a lot of the similar things that you would see in heterosexual relationships.
And I think that's a good segue into, I guess, my next question, which is, what are some ways that or I should say, how do the unhealthy aspects of masculinity show up in navigating relationships for individuals in the LGBTQ community?
I think since there's so many different ways that masculinity can show up, it does depend. One, it depends on the people who are in a relationship, like the way that two maybe women who are in a relationship together navigate masculinity could look very different than two men or non-binary or gender non-conforming individuals. And in a lot of ways, because people are taught that masculinity is inherently unhealthy, which isn't true, but because that's what they're taught, a lot of those things can show up when people feel like they're not able to be as kind of how I'm mentioning, they're not able to be as soft. They're not able to be vulnerable. They're not able to kind of navigate the relationship just as a person. They're expected to hold these certain roles, like who's a provider and who's not. And that's not necessarily because they feel masculine, but maybe they just present masculinely, like their clothing. And so because of someone's physical appearance, a lot of the times they associate, well, if you're this, then that means you have to be masculine, which means since you have to be masculine, this is what you have to do. But that might not necessarily be true, because they're thinking of women or folks who identify as women and are masculine, even though they're masculine presenting, they're still expected to hold these masculine, these unhealthy, these toxic masculine traits. And so it definitely depends on the relationship and how folks navigate it, but a lot of the times it ends up being emulating a system that people are taught, and that emulation can end up being abuse, or there can end up being a lot of miscommunication, because the way that folks are taught how to navigate a relationship is in the way that cis straight women and cis straight men are taught how to navigate a relationship, and that could look really different. Because from my experience, I've like I've been in, before I came out, I've been in relationships with like women. And so the way that abuse would show up would be a lot different than I was taught, because people would say that like usually like the masculine person is like physically abusive, and that this is what that looks like. And so thinking that, I'm like, oh, okay, so I guess a femme person can't be abusive. Like that's that association. And that ended up seeing, like, me and a lot of other peers were seeing that people were in relationships where they didn't feel safe, or they didn't feel like it's the right one for them, because they were like, well, we're two women, so that doesn't make a difference, right? That's like that I'm not in an abusive relationship. That can't happen. And I saw some of my friends, like gay men who were in relationships, they would be physically abusive, but they were like, oh, boys are just rough, so that's fine. And knowing those things, if people were taught what does a healthy relationship look like in general, without thinking of like not associating certain roles with certain gender, I think that people would have navigated relationships a lot differently. And a lot of folks could have saved a lot of heartbreak and trauma from being in these relationships that were really unhealthy, because folks just weren't, they didn't know what was right and what was wrong, because they weren't able to learn those things in a really safe way.
And that really makes me think of what you were saying about the lack of models that people have for what a relationship can look like that's healthy, and that isn't heterosexual, that isn't just to heterosexual cisgender people, and how that ends up kind of being a setup, especially for our youth who end up really not knowing how to navigate healthy interactions with each other, precisely for all the reasons that you said, right? They don't know what it looks like for two men to be in a relationship. They don't know what it looks like for two women to be in a relationship. And so the only thing that they have to work off of is what they've seen on TV or what they see in their daily lives, right? And that's not exactly the same thing. There may be some overlap, but for the most part, it's a very different sort of dynamic. Connor, did you have anything?
Yeah, well, just like, and I'm just thinking about like the more masculine people that I've personally dated, like they really have not been very open emotionally. So it's like I really hadn't even thought about it until just, we were just having this conversation right now. But yeah, no, we never really had more like those kind of like more, emotional conversations just about like what their, feelings about things were, what kind of things were important or not to them. And I think it just kind of goes back to that, original socialization that, guys, especially guys that are that, hyper masculine ideal, they don't talk about their feelings. They keep everything inside and just, push all that down.
So, Addison, you said something about that I thought was really interesting, where you said there's sort of a difference between feeling or, I guess, being masculine versus just presenting as masculine, and like the pressure for one to mean the other. I guess you could say. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So for me, like, because so I identify as non-binary, but I'm very masculine presenting, and I had to understand what masculinity meant in order to navigate that. And it was really hard to figure out what being masculine meant without a lot of things being associated, like with, if you're masculine, that means you go outdoors. And I'm like, I don't go outdoors. So does that mean I'm not masculine? But like, there's these things that people associate it, like activities or things that people associate it with masculinity. And I was like, I'm very emotional and I like talking to people. And I'm all these things that people don't normally associate with masculinity, but I identify as masculine, and I know I present masculinely. And I think, and in knowing that that's like a choice I get to make, it meant me understanding like what's the difference between presenting masculinely and being masculine. And it was me really defining what that meant for myself. So then when I would talk to other people who identified as masculine, whether they be men or non-binary, but really identified with that masculinity, it would be so different from them. They'd be like, well, I want to be a provider, or like these traditional things that are associated with masculinity. But then I also heard some folks be like, I love cooking. I love singing, things like that. And I was like, so really it's about like you identifying what masculinity means, And I was so glad that I was able to like have these conversations, because I think that it made it a lot easier for me to understand like what like masculinity isn't in itself unhealthy. I've just been taught that that I've been taught an unhealthy form of masculinity. And when when I see specifically with women who are more masculine presenting, sometimes there's these traditional things that come with that masculine presentation they just don't do, not because they aren't, not because they're associating, but they're like, I'm just not masculine. They're like, I don't identify with that. That's not something I identify with. Even though I may dress in this way, doesn't mean that these are things that I want to associate myself with. And that was really interesting as well, because I was like, well, I was taught that if you're masculine presenting, that also means that you have to be masculine, right? They're like, no, that's not what that means. They're like, that's the last thing I want. And so it's really understanding that like there's these traits that are associated with masculinity that don't have to be, and if you do the work to be able to do so, because it's not easy, really understanding that masculinity, it's kind of a concept that you can define on your in whatever way best fits for you, and you don't necessarily have to fit into what you've been taught masculinity is.
Yeah, and that really jives with what we in our work do, which is we talk about the idea of a dominant story of masculinity versus a counter story. And so it's, from what you're saying, it's like the dominant story is the things that people project onto you, that is what masculinity should mean, right? And things that they teach you about what masculinity should mean. And the
Right.
counter story is the masculinity that you define for yourself, right? So it's like it's what you decide masculinity is going to mean.
Yeah, precisely.
So we've talked a bit about unhealthy masculinity. So let's pivot more towards the sort of the positive, the pro-social. So what are some ways that healthy masculinity either shows up in LGBTQ communities or could be beneficial to those communities?
I think I'm starting to see a slow sort of movement of more like femme and like trans and just a wider array of gender, acceptance. Like there's a big movement for like people to take like no fats, no femmes off of their, dating profiles.
Mm-hmm.
And just talking about how you don't have to like everything, but you don't need to be like outwardly hostile to people. So I think that that's one of the good things. I think people are more willing to have conversations. Like for me, I'm also trans, and when I transitioned and when I started passing more, one of the things that was really important for me was to sort of use that privilege to start having those conversations. So especially working in social work, most of my coworkers have been women. So like if I hear a guy say something, terrible, I'm always like, I'm going to call it out, and like, I remember the first time I did that with one of my coworkers, and then after everybody was gone and she was like, thank you. She was so like shocked that anybody actually like called someone out for that. And these are the kinds of things that, I think that we need to start doing more, because that's what's going to start making those changes.
Yeah. Addison, did you have anything?
Yeah, I'd have to say, I think healthy masculinity, I think, will also help people understand like how they choose to navigate the world a little bit better, instead of trying to because I think the way that masculinity shows up that I've experienced in the LGBTQ community is that for a lot of folks it's not seen as something that's positive. It's not seen that's something that's good. And if you understand, and if masculinity is understood and people are able to define it in the ways that best represent them, I think they'll find that there isn't a right way, and there isn't like a right way to be masculine, but there are unhealthy ways you can be masculine. And I think once they're able to realize that, the way that folks like thinking of like what people put in their dating profiles, or thinking of the ways that people see relationships, they're able to really tell like what is and isn't okay. Like just because there are certain things associated with masculinity or femininity that like are good or bad, doesn't mean that these things are supposed to be normal. Like abuse isn't normal, abuse isn't okay. And knowing, because I know that usually is where I see how masculinity can show up in a lot of like LGBTQ relationships and the way that people interact with outside of that as well. But mainly they're just from people having these unhealthy ideas, what they need to do, and then perpetuating them. But I think if they understand that these are things that are unhealthy and not associating them with masculinity, it might be a lot easier for folks to identify when a relationship isn't good for them, whether it be romantic or just like friendships and family and things like that. But also I think people not being restricted to what they think something means. I think it's also important, like, you know, people are already having to come out for like their gender or their sexuality, and that's all its own thing to navigate. But being able to just like navigate what does coming into this identity mean for you without thinking of unhealthy masculinity, but like just thinking of how they can define stuff for themselves can be really impactful.
I think my favorite part about this conversation is, one of the things that we consistently get when we try to go around the country and talk about these topics is that people will say, what about LGBTQ people? And the way it's asked is often very sort of like, help me understand. I'm sort of mystified by, what's happening. And, what this conversation I feel is bringing out is that there are a lot of the same kinds of pressures. Obviously, it's different for different people. Different communities experience it differently, but they're the same kinds of like pressures to conform, pressures to try to navigate models of what it means to be masculine when you don't really have ones that you want to work off of that are healthy, right? And so I think it's really great that we get to talk about this in a way that I think speaks to sort of how we're all kind of messed up by these systems, right? And so I guess what I want to talk about next is what might be some ways that cisgender men in particular could learn from trans men and non-binary people about healthy masculinity, or some tips and tricks, just so to speak.
Did you want to?
I'm thinking. So if you've got something, go
All right,
ahead.
Cool. I'd say not trying to force people to conform, because that's a big lesson that I learned just from navigating my own gender, my own sexuality, and then also because those are its own things, and then understanding how do I want to present those things to the world. And I'm choosing to present those things in a masculine way, and I've been able to define what that means, and I've been able to ask people like, what does this look like? What does this mean? And being honest about when I'm also doing something that could be perpetuating toxic masculinity, and being able to use that, like, yes, I know I don't identify as a man, but I do benefit from masculinity in ways that men do. And so being able to use that as a privilege, to really advocate for folks who might not be able to do that in as safe a way as I can. I think, and when thinking of those things, it's like, it's no different for cisgender men than it is LGBTQ men, whether they're trans identified, non-binary, or masculine of center in some sort of way, because those pressures are still the same, just how we're navigating them looks a lot different, and impacts us differently in our own individual lives. But, it's okay to also challenge those things. Like, if you're like, why can't I hug all of my guy friends the same way that my friends who are girls can all hug each other? It's something that to like think about. Because as I've been able to confront, like, as I've navigated my masculinity, I've had the benefit of having friends who are guys who are then open to understanding, like, oh, you can just hug another guy and it's like fine, or oh, you can just be, because you can just be friends with guys and be close to them and be able to like be open, because I had to teach my friends how to like be emotional, and it's hard though, because you're taught not to be. And I saw those things popping up, but being able to teach my friends, like, we laugh through it and work through it together, that we can learn from each other in ways that I don't think we had the best examples of, or the best like way, or the seen perpetuated in ways that were healthy, of like what it means to be masculine. So I think it's like being open, being honest with each other, And definitely being able to like break conformity, like being comfortable doing that. It's not easy, but being able to push those boundaries of what you've been taught is also really important, and being able to see that happen within a community that is already pushing boundaries. It shows just like it, even with everything going on, it can still be a challenge, but you can still do it in your own communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like what Addison said.
Connor, did you have anything?
I don't think I really have anything to add on to that. Yeah, I mean, I think just, being open to having the conversations like this, and listening, that's the thing. People have to be willing to hear it.
So one of the things that I think tends to happen, especially for people who aren't in communities, is they tend to sort of homogenize the idea of LGBTQ communities, right? So the idea is that there's just sort of this one community, but like we know that that's not the case, right? Like there's communities within communities, right? And it's so much of it is determined by like region, like what it means to be gay in DC is vastly different from what it means to be gay in New York, or what it means to be gay in Missouri, right? And what it means to be trans is just a very different experience. In one region, there's completely different kinds of like cultures almost. And so what I wanted to talk about a little bit is just, thinking locally, what are some things that you all experience about, different LGBTQ communities in DC that you think are just really unique to the region?
There's like a weird age gap, I'd say, with the LGBTQ community in DC. There are a lot of, I'd say, like a lot of teens who identify as LGBTQ, and kind of like the work that's been done to give them spaces. They have them, but they're not the best spaces for them. So there is still a need to find community in some sort of way. And because of that gap in age, like it's also hard to find like ways to meet other LGBTQ folks depending on like folks' age, or what's the word, like social events they like attending. DC is interesting because from what I know, all of them seem to be around like going to like bars or something. So like nothing wrong with that, but there's not too many events that happen outside of like bars or happy hours that are like LGBTQ. And but even with that, like there's still sometimes ways to like really interact with different age groups. I think just like from like my experience, I enjoy being able to listen to folks who are older in LGBTQ and younger, just because there's so many different experiences, and like being able to like hang out in those ways are really nice. But it's just so interesting because of what social activities happen in DC.
Right.
But I know there are things that happen. I just don't know where and how that are not at bars. But I will say, like for the younger folks, a lot of the community that's meant for LGBTQ youth, it's like I've noticed that it's been around like advocacy, like being able to push issues that people align with. That's where a lot of people are able to find community, because folks are trying to like create a new do what everyone is hoping to do and create a world that's better for the next generation. And so a lot of folks that I have met have been through like community organizing or organizing in general around some really important topics. So it definitely is interesting. DC is like an interesting place to meet some LGBTQ folks that I don't hear necessarily in other areas or places around the country.
Connor, did you
Yeah.
something?
Well, I'm trying to because like I was in very different communities when I was in New York. Like I'm very like my community down here in DC is very like queer, but also the queer tends to be more people who were assigned female at birth, as opposed to like cisgender queer identify. I feel like the gay men's community is still very like cis focused and insular, which isn't necessarily different than anywhere else. But like that's nice to have here. Like the queer community in New York, I felt was a little bit, and I don't really know how, like it's I think it maybe has to do with like DC being such a political town.
Mm-hmm.
Like it feels almost a little bit more, I don't know, just sort of, I don't want to say polite, but just like generally more acceptable or something, where New York just felt like they were more like fringe outcast kind of folks.
Interesting.
And I'm sure there were other, that was just the folks that I had run into before I moved out of New York. But yeah, I mean, I think things are different everywhere, and there are small little pockets of places that are, we all find the places that we feel comfortable being just sort of naturally.
So as people who primarily work with young people, or people who are trying to navigate these different systems and get their needs met, what would you say are some of the things that you've observed are the most pressing for young people?
I'd say resources. Like, I know that's like really broad, but generally access to any resources is really hard for a lot of our young people to navigate. Whether it's housing, social services, education, mental health, physical health, legal things. There's just like the lack of resources they have access to be able to complete things or do things that they need to do to be able to survive is astonishing. When like I've had young people who are like, I don't even know, like, how do doctor's appointments work? Like, how do I set one up? And it's like, it is as simple as calling and making an appointment, but it's not that simple. Like, there's so many different factors that go into making what can be a simple decision for some people. It's not for a lot of our young people. And because there's also the added layers of not only do they have to go to these get resources or services, they have to hope that they'll be respected when getting those services, whether it's their name, their pronouns, just like all of these things come into mind when they're having to access them, which can be scary. Like these systems and services are scary for like adults, like older folks, that there's no way if it's scary for people who are like 50, 60, it's gonna be scary for people who are like 20 or 30 as well. So I think like with a lot of our young people, that's definitely a big need because they're able to find community in ways that they best know how. But when it comes to getting their needs met, that's where we really see the challenges start to pop up.
Yeah, and just kind of like piggybacking on that, when so much of your time and emotional energy is focused on getting those, basic needs met, having enough food, having a place to sleep, having, an ID, like you're not sitting there thinking about like, am I being misogynist? Like that's just not, and like, who are my healthy role models? Like that's just not the kind of thing that you have time to like put any energy into. It's really, just about getting those basic needs met. So I think the like more comfortable and safe and, and people hate to say this, the easier we can make it, because everybody's like, oh, we can't make it so easy. Like, no, the easier we can make things, the quicker people get through it. And then the quicker they become like more well-rounded, like, fully functioning people. And it's, I've worked with youth for, almost 10 years now. And it's a slow process. And, it's a slow process for people that, have two parents at home with good incomes and, go to like good quality schools and everything like that. They're still a mess when they graduate college at 22 years old. Think about being 19 and on the street. Like you can't expect them to just go out and get a job tomorrow.
So. And I think we would be remiss, particularly at this moment in our society, to not talk about some of the specific things that LGBTQ people of color face, particularly from even within their own communities with other LGBTQ people. So if you all would feel comfortable sort of speaking to some of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think navigating, like as a Black person navigating the LGBTQ community, there is times where race does pop up in ways that I think, like you think a marginalized group wouldn't marginalize, but like that, it happens. It happens within different groups. Because a lot of the times when I'm navigating them, it's I notice there aren't that many Black folks maybe in the space even, or if they are, they may not be the ones that are talking. And I think that that's really important for me to notice, because it's like, well, if they're not even in the space, and if they are, they're not talking, like what voices are we missing out from these conversations? Whether it's a simple conversation around like, you know, how people's days are going, to like having complex conversations around race or gender, or like any of these big topics that like you could have a conversation around, and that perspective is missing. But it's also difficult because in those spaces, I feel like I have to, like how I am as a Black person is different than navigating Black spaces as a queer and trans person. And so it's challenging, because it is kind of like picking an identity. I try to make sure I don't pick my identity, because that they're both a part of me and they're both very important. But the way that I navigated coming out was a lot different, because it was me challenging. Like a lot of people are like, "Oh, you're queer or you're trans. That's not a Black person thing. That's like a white person thing." I'm like, that's literally not how this works. It's not about race. It's literally my like it's literally my identity. That has nothing to do with it. But it was something that was really real for me to have conversations about, and navigating with, because a lot of, when I went to high school, a lot of the people I was around were Black folks, and I was one of the few queer people who were out, and navigating that was really challenging. But then when trying to find spaces that were LGBTQ friendly, it was hard to find people of color, like not even just Black folks, but people of color in general. So it's a unique position to be in, because it's navigating two different spaces as your whole self, and those spaces kind of only acknowledging part of you. And so it can be a challenge trying to figure out how best to be in those spaces. But specifically where I find the challenges in Black communities, there's a lot of homophobia, particularly towards gay men. And then there's a lot of, I don't know how to best describe it, but the way that men view trans women, like I know Connor, you mentioned that earlier. It's so different, because it's like, well, I like this woman, but this woman wasn't born a woman, so does that mean I'm gay? It's like, no, you're dating a woman. So that doesn't, that like, and it's because it's scary. Like it's scary to be thought of as not straight, to be thought of these things. And so it's like people, even if they do are like solidified, like, okay, I date women, and that includes trans women, they're then having to face hate in themselves for like, well, that means you're like, people are attacking their identity. And I think it's just the way that I've navigated that space is a totally different, because it is breaking down what does it mean, what does sexuality and gender mean, and really trying to help people understand. So when they meet someone, or when they're talking to someone, they're able to handle those interactions a lot better. Because I really want my like folks who are LGBTQ or queer and trans, who are Black, to be able to be Black and those identities in as safest way as possible. Because finding a community that only aligns with one identity isn't really enough, to really feel safe and to feel accepted.
Have your whole self uplifted. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And it really makes me think of a friend of mine. We were talking, and he was saying to me, he was like, for the longest time, I had no idea what it was like as an Asian man to like love another Asian man, because the only images that I saw of two gay men loving each other never seemed to look like that, And so I think about, when we think about the idea, quote unquote, of the LGBTQ community, there's a very white sort of front image, that can be very alienating for people whose communities don't look like that, right? And who don't want to be in community that looks like that, or who can't be in community that looks like that, right? And so they're challenged by there being a sort of, like you said, the idea that it's a white thing, even though that's not the case. And then when they get into LGBTQ communities, they may have one part of their identity affirmed, but then they're having to deal with racism that they didn't have to deal with in their community with other people of color. So yeah, it's really challenging, right? Because you're trying to navigate the sort of assumptions that people have in so many different areas. And you want to be in a community with like both in some sense, right? But you're having to sort of pick and choose how you fight your battles, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think it also is a huge factor, going back to like just resources. At the end of the day, so much of our funding and so much of, the dictation of where resources go is still made by like, cis white men. I think back even to like, I started working with LGBTQ youth in about 2008. And drug use has been a problem for LGBTQ youth for years. And like, we were trying to get money for drug, programs, but it wasn't until like white gay kids started using crystal meth where it's like, oh, we need to put money into drug use, and then now it's the opioid crisis. And so it's a whole other, now everybody cares. And so it's like getting people to understand that it's like, it's not about what you think the issues are. It's about what those of us, and people who are doing, who are from those communities and working with those communities are telling you are what they say that they need, not what you think that they need. I think that that's one of the big challenges as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I think it brings us back to, it's not just about preferences in dating. It's not just about who you hang out with. Like the impact of racism and sexism and homophobia is that it determines who gets resources, right? It determines, what bills get passed, who decides people are worthy of drug intervention and relief from homelessness and things like that, right? So as we're sort of coming up on our Q&A portion, I just want to take us through some last couple questions. So can we as primary prevention specialists work to promote some healthier understandings within LGBTQ communities?
I think just continuing, I think one really important way to promote like healthy understandings is to really help people like understand like defining masculinity. I think understanding that it's like, I know I kept saying it throughout, but I think it is something that's really important. It's just like understanding what masculinity means and how does it look in a healthy way is so impactful to how people internalize it, because the images and the messages that we see, we internalize. And I think once people are able to internalize it in a way that's healthier and break down their understandings that they have had, can really help specifically LGBTQ folks to understand like how can they create their own systems that are healthier and better serve everyone in the community.
And I think looking at sort of motivation and like, I don't want to say reward, but it's like, okay, if your idea of masculinity is picking on someone who is smaller and weaker than you, like, what are you getting out of that? How is that making you feel strong? And sort of kind of tearing that down from the beginning. Like, isn't it a stronger thing to be someone who actually would protect that person as opposed to being someone who would tear them down? And wouldn't that time and energy be better spent on doing something more constructive for you? And just, starting to kind of examine those, things and talk about where those things come from, and the overreaching effects that they have throughout society.
All right, I'm gonna let Will in here. I was kind of drunk with power there for a second. Need to deny him entry. So Will is going to join us just to relay some of the questions that people have had in the chat.
All right. So thank you all for a wonderful conversation. So we do have. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we have a couple of questions. The first question comes from Levi, and I'm just going to read it out. So Levi says, our agency does outreach with street-involved youth. We're examining how to be a safer space for LGBTQ plus youth. But for many of our street-involved youth, it's not safe to be out. Do you have any thoughts on how our outreach workers can promote what they're accepting without putting participants, many are young men, at risk of outing themselves or facing violence from their peers?
I think the best thing you can always do in those situations is ask the young people what they need. And then being able to, because a lot of the work that SMYAL does, it's the youth informing what we do and we best serving them to in that capacity. So if there are ways that if you ask youth, like what would make you feel safe without outing you, those could be it could be a great start to really figuring it out, because we know what our population of young people need based off of what they tell us. And then with people who maybe identify in those communities, being able to like take that information and best serve the youth. Because you won't know what they need if you don't ask them in a lot of ways. So I think that could be an important first step. And trying to use words that indicate inclusiveness without necessarily being LGBTQ. All are welcome, or just like trying to make sure use that language instead of inherently saying LGBTQ or putting up a rainbow or something somewhere, because safety is a really big concern for a lot of folks over acceptance sometimes. But having those small indications can be a really great reminder of like, okay, I see this place and they're trying, so it'll be worth checking out.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also depending on what sort of things you're handing out, you can even be that specific. Like if you're handing out information about like healthcare, you could say like women's health here, LGBTQ sensitive healthcare here, HIV healthcare here, you know, and list those specific places, just so that people know that you are, you know, sensitive to that. Make sure that people, you know, that the people that you're doing outreach know that if they do want to come to you, that will be, you know, a safe place to make, you know, to make that choice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And the next question comes from James via Twitter. And it's not specifically for you, Connor, but he mentioned you in the question. The question was, you mentioned, you know, challenging, you know, unhealthy notions when your friends or colleagues say things that may be, you know, inappropriate. James wants to know, as an ally, how can he on a daily basis continue to, you know, basically be a good supportive ally?
I mean, just having those conversations, like when you hear the, you know, the homophobic joke, when you hear, you know, the misogynistic comment, like just be like, that's not cool. Like one of my old coworkers made a joke about, you know, hurting his ex-wife. I'm like, no, that's not cool. Like, that's not funny. That's not a joke. Like, you don't need to be doing that. You know, and just making sure people know that that's not okay with you. And then I think slowly those things will start to be like, okay, it's not automatically like the funny thing or the okay thing to say.
We do a whole thing on bystander intervention strategies, and one of the things that we talk about in our work is how, you know, it doesn't always look like intervening in a violent situation. Sometimes it looks like intervening in a situation where someone has said something or done something that's inappropriate. And one of the things that we talk about is that there are multiple different ways to intervene. And so sometimes it's the direct sort of, you know, that's not okay, we're not going to accept that here. And sometimes it's, you know, asking questions, you know, what about that was, you know, if someone tells a joke, you say, you know, what's the joke? What about that's funny? You know, break it down for me, you know. And a lot of what we talk about also is sort of finding allies in the space who can, in those moments, back you up and say, you know, we as people who are in this workspace, who are in this community, don't find that behavior acceptable, right? And so the positive power of peer pressure in that moment to sort of change the environment.
And also just one other thing, like continuing to learn to like read, you know, blog posts, read books, read, you know, things by, you know, queer LGBTQ folks about what things are important to them and about, you know, healthy masculinity, because the more you understand, the more you're able to verbalize, the more you're able to recognize, you know, things that are microaggressions. Because if you're just like, oh, that's wrong, and they're like, why? And you're like, I just know it's wrong. It's not going to be as effective as if you can break down what sort of negative impact that what they just said.
Addison or G, anything else to add?
No, I think everyone said it in the best way possible. Yeah, just intervening in those situations when you can, and continuing to educate yourself, because I think education is a big piece to really being a better ally. Just because once you understand, you can then best communicate it to other people, like why something is wrong or why it's not okay.
I would just add, be willing to be embarrassed, be willing to be the one who says the thing that no one else is willing to say. And you may look strange in that moment and you may be a little bit alienated in that moment, and that's okay. And also check in with the person. If there's, if you're intervening on someone's behalf, check in with them and see if they even want that. Because sometimes we may think we're helping, but we may be actually in some ways putting more of a spotlight on people who would just like to not have a spotlight on them.
Awesome. So that was everything for the questions. I do want to lift up one of the resources that we have over at Men Can Stop Rape, which is our Ask Assault Services Knowledge platform. We have a number of resources on there specifically geared towards the LGBTQ plus community. So I put it in the YouTube comment chat box. So I would definitely encourage everyone listening to check out that resource as well. And we'd also like to continue to lift up all the wonderful work that the folks are doing over at SMYAL. With that, thank you all again, and I'll let you all wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So did you all have any final thoughts that you want to share?
I think this was a great conversation. And I don't have anything else to share, but I do, other than that, like masculinity is really a journey. Thinking of it from this LGBTQ perspective, is that there are a lot of things we're taught on what it means, but not all of them are true. And there are ways that you can be masculine and not perpetuate these unhealthy traits that people have like normalized in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm quite a bit older than Addison is. And one of the benefits that comes with that as you get older is you start to a lot of times care less about what people think, and sort of it makes it easier to be like, okay, this is who I am. And so if you can get there younger, like just think about it, like why don't you want to own yourself right now? So yeah, like just spend less time worrying about what other people think and more time being who you want to be. Other than that, just thanks for sticking in there and watching with us.
Yeah. So thank you both for joining us. I thought this was really great. And I'm glad we're able to make this happen. I know it took a while to sort of put this together. We've been looking forward to it for a long time. So thank you both again for joining us, and thanks SMYAL for all the good work they do. If you all would like to learn any more about what Mixer does, you can go to our website, and you all can plug your stuff if you'd like as well.
Great.
Yeah, we if folks are wanting to know more about SMYAL, going to SMYAL.org. All of the information about our programs, ways to get involved are on there as well. And for any young people listening, our Instagram, it's pretty great. It's at smile_DMB. It's awesome if you want to figure out what's going on in our day-to-day programs there.
Great. And like I said, anyone can go to www.mixer.org, mcsr.org, to learn more about what Men Can Stop Rape does. So thank you both for joining us, and I look forward to hearing from you all in the future.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.